bbcon regular, you know this guy, Ryan Hyde. We've stolen him for a few minutes, both from his job that keeps him busy and from his pedagogical activity. So Ryan, you go around the country and maybe the world, sharing your knowledge on things, fundraising, analytics, database management. I met Ryan through the donor participation project, and well, in fact, we met on Mastodon.
Correct.
And I was floored by just his level of insight. So Ryan, I'd love for you to say hi to everybody and introduce yourself, share a little bit more about your background.
Yeah. I'm Ryan Hyde. I am a donor database and analytics manager at a major kind of human family and children resources center in upstate New York. I've been in the fundraising world for 9 years now, actually pretty much to the day almost. And in that time, I've focused on the donor database side of things. I started doing basic data entry, learned the ropes of database management, took that over at the last organization I was at, and with the help of some people in my life who are really great at analytics, I've kind of learned how to build out visualizations and bring insights to organizations so that they can make real data-driven decisions. And yeah, as Louis said, I've been presented at bbcon for the past 4 years. So if you're in the Blackbaud ecosystem and you've attended bbcon, you may have seen me. If I don't know how many people in here are really database manager types, so you may not have dropped into my sessions because they're really more for that audience. But we'll for today's topic, we'll keep things. Certainly, we're talking about data, but I'm not going to dive into so much of the nitty gritty, how to actually pull the specific numbers. Though I do have information on that if anybody wants it or wants to chat about that later as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. And I guess a good starting point is anybody who's interested in learning more about Ryan. I usually say this at the end, but please connect with him. Most of us are on LinkedIn. There may be people. We also restream this to Twitch. So if there's somebody on Twitch, head over to LinkedIn and connect with Ryan if you have questions about this type of stuff. But our main thesis, your main thesis today, Ryan, is that donor retention, the year-to-year donor retention is not the best way to look at the underlying concepts, right? Like loyalty, things like that.
That's correct. I think it's a metric that it's easy to pull, and because it's easy to pull, people get a little bit fixated on it, but it really only answers one very specific question, that question of how many donors who gave last year also then gave this year. There are so many other parts, kind of segments of your donor population that you need to keep track of, and there are definitely more intelligent ways. Not that a retention rate is unintelligent. It is something that you should track, but there are other ways to visualize and conceptualize your entire donor audience that would lead to some kind of more interesting questions for your organization.
And we didn't know, but this is a quasi-religious organization. We definitely have strong feelings about these things. Thank you, Kurt. And I've shared this a couple of times, Ryan, and maybe you've seen it, where it's actually possible to have your donor retention as a percentage going up while you're losing donors.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
It's not great. So you have a presentation, I understand, today. Well, I'll encourage you to take it over.
Hang on. Oops.
And while you fiddle with the platform, and here's where everybody sees that we're actually live. If people have questions, if you're listening to this and you have questions, we'd love to try to answer them, or at least get Ryan's perspective on them today. Maybe share, what role you are in to inform that perspective. But it would be interesting to know who's looking at donor retention. Ryan just said it was easy to pull. My understanding is that even though it's easy to pull, few people do it. So maybe what you come out today thinking is, well, I shouldn't really even bother. Okay.
I'm having trouble actually sharing my screen here on the Restream.
Got it. I'm on it. Yeah, we're just a second. I'll get to it.
Okay.
And now Ryan is going to play Guitar Hero solos.
Yes.
Let me see. Is this on the screen for everybody?
I see that. Yep.
Okay, just give me instructions.
So yeah, just open up the DPP coverage ratios PowerPoint, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Thanks so much for preparing this, Ryan. We really appreciate
absolutely. Okay, so I like to throw in some clickbaity taglines there. So one weird metric. Okay, we can advance this forward. Just some of those things about me, and also some contact information there. At the end of this, I'll have Luis share this link that to the OneDrive folder that he has there, so you can download these slides. And also, there's a template for the coverage ratio metric that I'm going to be talking about here. But feel free to reach out to me if you need to, and if you haven't tried Mastodon before, open up an account, because it's way better than Twitter.
And you meet like random people like we did, and suddenly you connect and you can learn so much. So it's
pretty good nonprofit community on there. Okay, we can advance that then. So click one more time for me. So why do so many organizations focus on retention rates? It's because people want to be seen and want to think of themselves as data-driven, but a lot of folks don't really have a very broad sense of what being a data-driven organization actually means. Click once more. And like I said, retention rates are really easy to calculate. And often, this is one of the really key things. When you start calculating retention rate, a lot of organizations see that their retention rate looks low. It may be 45% or 52% or something like that. At the last organization I was at, every year my my retention rate was like 51.6% or something. And I had a boss who just thought that was like too low, and we were constantly fixated on trying to find ways to increase that retention rate. But really, a 50% retention rate is quite good, and it's not an area of concern if that's where your retention rate is. So we can move forward. Oh, hi, Christine. So the focusing on that retention rate is unintentionally misguided. Click again here. I shouldn't have added so many animations now that I realize I can't really click. So here's the first big thing. Most loyal donors to your organization do not consistently give in every single 12-month period. We sort of think that if a donor really, really likes you, that they're giving every single year. But donors don't keep track of their giving always like that. Move forward one more. In fact, the median donation interval is actually 15 months. So, and I've seen this at multiple organizations, and Blackbaud actually kind of has this baked into some of their internal metrics in NXT. If you were to look at all of the donors who you kind of classify as consistent donors, and you can do that saying that they've given 4 gifts within the past 5 years, maybe you can do a query that would pull those kind of donors. And then you looked at the difference between their 2 most recent gifts, and the median gift tends to be right around 15 months, meaning a lot of these donors are lapsing by a couple of months pretty regularly, even though they are consistent donors. Move forward for me.
Yeah. Hey, and a question about this, Ryan.
Yeah.
I kind of follow Kirk here on LinkedIn, and he was saying this trend he was seeing might have even been exacerbated during COVID. So you're seeing people who are loyal to all intents, but they may have dropped out for a longer period.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, the pandemic threw all kinds of wrenches into the systems. We saw lots of brand new donors who were probably never going to retain. We saw that exact sort of lapsing behavior with other donors who were more reticent about giving at the specific time because of all kinds of reasons. So yeah, certainly. Yeah, and like I said, what appears like a low retention rate might actually be pretty good. Click, I think I have 3 more float. There we go. So again, a retention rate above 50% is pretty good. I wouldn't worry about that. If your retention rate is between 40 and 50%, it's okay. I wouldn't worry about it too much. You might want to see if there's some obvious subset of your population that you can do a little bit more work with. And a retention rate below 40% is where I would start focusing on that a little bit more. But these are my rules of thumb. I've seen many different organizations' retention rates, so this tends to be what normal looks like. If you're at 50 or above, great. So here's the thing. You can't improve what you don't measure. And when you're only measuring retention rate, there's a lot of things you're not measuring and therefore unable to actually directly improve. So let's move forward. Okay, so here's where we're going to get into what a coverage ratio is and why it's so much better than a retention rate. So first off, you have to visualize your donors as existing inside of a bucket. All right. And this is not something that's unique to nonprofits or anything. Businesses talk about coverage ratios as well. So for any donor population that is in this bucket, you're going to have to come to grips with the fact that some contents of that bucket is constantly leaking out, and you're never going to be able to stop that. Nobody has a non-leaky bucket. Donors pass away, donors move away, donors become disinterested for any number of reasons. What you really want to try to pay attention to is how fast those donors are leaving your bucket and how many donors are coming back into your bucket. I don't have a visualization for that flow in section here. But we're kind of looking at 3 different populations in this metric. You're looking at your brand new donors, your newly acquired donors, your recaptured donors, all right, donors who had given at some time in the past, were lapsed for a while, but now have given again, and then your lapsed donors as well. When you create a ratio based on this, basically you're adding your new and recaptured donors, you're dividing that by your lapsed donors, and you're ending up with a percentage. A percentage of 100% means that you added or recaptured just as many donors as you lapsed. So your donor population will have stayed steady, regardless of what your retention rate is. You will have as many donors last year or this year as you did last year because it was at a perfectly even retention or coverage ratio. If it's higher than 100%, that's great. That means your donor population is increasing. If it's lower than 100%, that's where you want to start investigating why, because your donor population is officially deflating at that point. Okay, let's move forward. So this is an example of a coverage ratio. I got to pull up my copy here because this is a bit small on my screen. 1 second. Okay, so when I pull a coverage ratio, I like to actually do it for a 10-year time period. It's probably overkill to look, because obviously what happened 10 years ago doesn't really matter a ton to what happened right now, but it does tend to give some context for the way things have been going. So if you don't do a full 10-year ratio, I would do at least 5, 6, or 7 years when you're pulling this, because just to have a sufficient amount of context. So Kirk asks, so from that perspective, it is lapsed last year rather than cumulative, correct? Yeah, specifically, how many have lapsed within the past? How many donors who gave last year did not give this year? So it's that snapshot of time, Kirk. I think that's what you're asking. So in this visualization here, and when I share the link at the end of this, I have a template of this coverage ratio that you can use to fill your own data with. First, look at the top 3 lines. We've got new donors, reactivated donors, and lapsed donors. So those new donors are pretty easy to query on in most database systems. There's different ways you can do that. And by the way, these numbers they're loosely based on my current organization, and I wanted to have an accurate story here, though that I've changed the actual numbers just for the sake of it. So in this particular case, we're looking at new donors last year. In 2022, I had 705. Reactivated donors. So again, this is the one that gets a little bit tricky to think about. It gets a little bit tricky to query, but we are looking at donors who, in this case, did not give in 2021. They did give in 2022, and they also gave at any point prior to 2021. So they had been donors in the past. They might have been very, very lapsed or just recently lapsed. Their last gift prior to 2022 may have been either in 2020 or 1989. I don't know. But they did give this year, so they've come back into the fold for whatever reason. And then you're looking at your lapsed donors. How many donors did you actually lose from last year? And I'm representing that as a negative number here, just because that's easier for people to think about. So you take new donors plus reactivated donors divided by lapsed donors, and you will get that ratio. So for this scenario in 2022, we have a ratio of 86.62%. That's below 100. That means that my total donor population decreased. That's not great. But if I look at what my ratio was in 2021, I can at least say I'm on an upward trajectory. There's some kind of momentum in that direction. So that's possibly good to see. I also like juxtaposing this with a classic retention rate because retention rates aren't useless. It's just that you need to be looking at them in the context of the broader scope of your whole annual giving program. So you can see below the coverage ratio line, there's total donors and returning donors. And of course, because our ratio in 2022 was lower than 100%, you can see that total donors number dropped from 1,935 to 1,762. You can also see that our retention rate increased. And this kind of goes to, I think you said it was Kirk's point earlier, that you can have a retention rate that is better year over year, but your total number of donors actually decreases. So that's a bit of a problem. Now, again, the reason why I like to have many years of data in here is to kind of tell the story. And let me take a step back here. Analytics, measuring things and putting them in charts and graphs and stuff is all well and good. But if that is where the analytics ends, then it's basically useless. What good analytics should do is start a story, or should tell a story and start getting your organization to ask questions. So the questions in this particular chart should be pretty apparent. What in the world happened in 2019? What happened in 2020 after that? And what's going on in the last 2 years? Because it really just it dropped like a rock and then skyrocketed and then kind of is bouncing a little bit here. And so from the perspective, again, this is largely based on my current organization. From 2018 to 2019, we had a very large, in many years past, we had a very large corporate donor who was kind of taken over a lot of our fundraising. But we knew that they were going to be leaving at the end of 2018, and that they left. And after they left, most of the staff of the fundraising department here left. And now we have, in 2019, we had to hire on a completely new fundraising staff. We basically had nobody left who knew how things had been operating. And our coverage ratio, retention rate, total donor population, all of those things suffered tremendously because that wasn't planned for very well. Then in 2020, we experienced what basically everybody experienced, which was a huge influx of brand new donors. Look at that top line of new donors. In 2019, it was 483. In 2020, it was 1,266. That's about a 3x increase year over year in new donors. Most of that we didn't try super hard for. I wasn't here at the time, but I know that we didn't go out hunting for new donors, and most organizations didn't go out hunting for new donors in the midst of the pandemic, but lots of folks were stuck at home feeling helpless, wanted to help, and they got some stimulus money, and they said, you know what, I feel like I should probably give some of this to organizations that are helping people, and they did. The following year, the retention rate and coverage ratio both plummeted again, not as bad as 2019. But we all knew, and folks of us who have been in the game long enough, we all knew that most of those brand new donors from the beginning of the pandemic weren't coming back. Most new donors don't come back. It's really quite difficult to get a donor to give a second gift and become a more kind of sustainable part of your fundraising pipeline. So we knew that that was probably going to happen, and I imagine most of you, if you were to go to do this ratio for yourselves, you would see a similar drop below 100% after a spike. Might not be to this extent, but after a similar spike in 2020 into 2021. And then in 2022, we kind of, again, I look at this a little bit optimistically. We are heading in the right direction, given all of the turmoil that's happened in this organization since 2019. We're still not really sure what normal looks like, but it seems like we're getting closer to baseline, whatever our new baseline actually is. Hopefully by the end of this calendar year, we'll have a much better sense of what normal looks like for us. So anyways, that's the kind of story that this sort of visualization can bring up. But it can also get your team to ask very specific questions, because you are now measuring specifically your new donors, your reactivated donors, and how many donors lapsed. And you can decide, how do I want to solve for these different lines? What does my acquisition system actually look like? What things, when I see that, let's pretend the pandemic didn't happen. I wish we all wish we could do that. Let's pretend that didn't happen. When looking at 2020 and this huge influx of brand new donors, maybe I would be able to look at that year and look at what strategies we used to acquire new donors and figure out really what worked and what didn't. In that following year, we didn't have nearly as many reactivated donors in 2021 as we did in 2020. So I can look at, well, did we even really try to reactivate donors? What did we do to try to bring donors who had fallen off our radar for a couple of years? What did we actually attempt to do? Did we just send them the same piece of direct mail as we've always sent them? Or are we trying to market to them specifically to get them back into the fold? And then once they come back into the fold, how do we continue to steward them to make sure that they don't fall off again? And then, of course, the lapsed donors, we see how that number can change dramatically. If I see in a year my lapsed donors go up quite a lot, like they did from 2020 to 2021 or 2018 to 2019, I can ask, okay, well, did we miss something? Did we accidentally ignore some population that we shouldn't have? How can we correct for that in the upcoming year to make sure that those donors come back into the fold? And then actually, I want to show the next slide. We're not going to go all the way through the slides because I get into the very nitty gritty about how to actually pull these queries in Razor's Edge specifically, but I do want to look at the next one.
Ryan, yeah, can I ask you a question that I think maybe burning a hole in people's brains?
Yeah.
Which is, how did you do that wonderful gradient in the chart line?
Okay, so in the chart above the graph, the gradient is all just done in Excel. You can do your fill options, and when you download this, you'll be able to see the kind of parameters that I set.
Great, exactly.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, the gradient in the chart itself, you can't really have a formula for. So I just did a 3-color gradient. You have to manually do some sliders in there to make the yellow show up where it should show up and all of that. And any year that you update this, you kind of have to manually, dink around with those sliders a little bit.
If you're doing this, it's part of the story too, right? It's that story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, there's a lot of I guess I'm taking another step back here when it comes to visualizations. In general, you want to make sure that what you're making is easy to read, visually appealing, so that non-data people can look at it and understand it pretty quickly and start asking the right kinds of questions pretty quickly. Because people who are not data oriented are going to look at your average chart and graph and be like, I just don't want to. There's go away.
Yeah, exactly.
The easier you can make this stuff to comprehend, the better. And that big chart at the bottom of this is like, that's the easy entry point. We say, whoa, something bad happened in 2019. Whoa, something huge happened in 2020. And then you can use that as your segue into, okay, well, now let's look at the numbers associated with those things and figure out what those numbers are actually telling us.
So
cool. All right. So defining our logical parameters. I kind of mentioned this already, but I know a lot of people viewing this are probably not database managers, but I do want to discuss how we're thinking about every one of these numbers. So click one more for me. Okay, so acquired donors, this is really easy. Like I said, people who gave this year and never gave before. Easy. Recaptured donors, gave this year, whatever this year is. So, in this case, if I'm looking at 2022 and trying to do the most recent numbers, I'm looking at this year is 2022. For every year in the past that I'm thinking about, when I'm searching all the way back to 2016, this year is 2016. So they gave in the testing year. They did not give in the previous year, but they gave at some point, any point, prior to the year before this year. Okay. You can get trickier because, honestly, at some point, if a donor hasn't given in 10 years and they gave this year, they're probably more realistically, you should think of them as a newly acquired donor. But that gets even trickier to sort of pull consistently, and I'm not sure that it adds a ton of value. It adds a lot of complexity without adding necessarily a ton of value, is what I think. I try to keep things relatively simple for that metric.
And Ryan, maybe we can ask people who are here how they think about that. At what point do they consider somebody a new donor, even if they have given?
Yeah, I'll tell you that if you're, again, in the Blackbaud ecosystem and you're using Razor's Edge NXT, they have a built-in metric called a donor lifecycle metric. And in that metric, any donor who has not given in the past 5 years and then gives a new gift, they call them acquired.
Interesting.
Yeah. Also, in that lifecycle metric, they also say a donor is active if they've given within the past 15 months. So that kind of, again, across organizations, median interval between the last two gifts tends to be about 15 months, not 12 months. Anyways, lost donors. So these are donors who did give last year, but who did not give this year. Again, so it's not cumulative over time. It's a snapshot of that year. All right. And then this last section here. Some other things to consider. For every organization, you're going to want to consider what types of gift types you're looking at. I, for instance, do not consider in-kind gifts as part of my coverage ratio, but maybe in-kind gifts are an enormous part of what you're looking at, and they should be included for you. I don't know. Again, kind of speaking from a Blackbaud-centric point of view, you do want to include soft credits, but you want to also make sure that you're only looking at one member of each household. So if your database is set up where both spouses have their own individual constituent records, you want to make sure that your querying method only allows one of those records in. Otherwise, you start inflating your numbers. Okay. In the rest of the slide deck, I demonstrate how I accomplish that in Razor's Edge. But if you're not using Razor's Edge, then that won't help you. Do not exclude deceased donors. Do not exclude inactive donors. Do not exclude donors with no valid address, because just because they're deceased right now doesn't mean they were deceased last year. Okay. And this has to be an accurate representation. You have to include all kinds of donors in your metric. Otherwise, you end up kind of skewing your numbers and making yourself either look better or worse than you really are. Okay, so that's as many of the slide elements as I want to go through here. Again, everything after that point is really I have snapshots of how I query for the information in Razor's Edge. So if you're in that ballpark, then you can look at that on your own later, and you can certainly email me about it if you have any questions.
Yes, please. Contact Ryan here. We're going to be uploading the slides to the DPP resource library. So you can also get, somebody was asking, probably somebody who's on RE Next, they wanted all the nitty gritty. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah, check that out. Of course, all those queries are being built in Database View, not WebView. You can't really get granular enough in WebView to accomplish that. But definitely check that out and let me know if you've got any issues with that or just need some better explanations.
Awesome. I love Erin's comment where she does consider them new donors or acquired, but she has some little extra celebration. I'd love to learn what that's about.
Yeah, for
like
sure.
An office dance, or do you send them something?
And yeah, when another thing to think about actually in all of this, so those donors who gave 5+ years ago but gave this year, or your brand new donors who never gave before, when you start investigating those people, what you often find is that they are giving for really reasons that are unrelated to your fundraising efforts. For instance, the biggest one that I can think of is honor memorial donors.
Oh yeah.
You might say, wow, in 1 year I had like 150 extra new donors compared to the previous year. I wonder why that is. Look first at your honor memorial donors. Did you have 1 or 2 or 3 really big tribute events happening? And then be careful about how you continue with those donors, because they're really not giving because of you. They're giving because of somebody else, and that person is now gone. And so it's unlikely that they will give again. It's not to say that you shouldn't ever try to convert those donors, but you should maybe not put a ton of resources into that because they're just unlikely to give. And the same thing, a donor may have given an honor memorial gift 5 years ago, and they gave another gift this year because another person passed away or something like that. Or maybe somebody retired and they're doing it in tribute, in honor of, not in memory of somebody from your organization. Anyway, this is really a good starting point to investigate these segments of your donor population. It's not the be all. There's no metric that's the be all and end all of everything. Everything requires additional research and additional questioning.
This is fantastic. How does the dynamic work in your current organization, or maybe in others where you've worked? Is this something that you're pushing forward, or is the individual giving, annual give, whatever, is the team asking for that from you? Are you guys, are you meeting in the middle where, well, I think this is important and we want to look at this, and somehow, how does that dynamic work for you all?
So right now, I've been working at my current organization for just under a year. And I am definitely pushing this, but I'm fortunate enough to have a team who is kind of data oriented enough that they really appreciate this. They see the value in it pretty quickly, and they definitely want to make this part of the discussion every year. Also, at my organization, we do a July to June fiscal year. So I actually pull this twice a year, once looking at calendar years and once looking at fiscal years. And when you do it calendar year versus fiscal year, your graph is going to be a little bit different because everything is shifted by 6 months. But it allows you to kind of check in more often than once a year, because if you do just wait till once a year, you can sort of forget that this thing exists. Cool. Alia, I'm glad you appreciated that. And again, I know a lot of you aren't kind of the data pullers here, but if you want to share this with whoever is that person in your team, that's really how this started with me. So kind of back to your question there. When I first, my last organization is called Lollipop Farm. It's this huge animal welfare organization in upstate New York in the Rochester area. And one of my bosses just happened to be on a webinar at some point back in 2013. And somebody kind of brought up the notion of this coverage ratio and had some bullet points about basically what that was. And then they were like, "Hey Ryan, you're brand new. Can you figure out how to do this?" I was like, "Okay." And it took me a few months querying timelines of stuff, and when you're especially when you're brand new into Razor's Edge, figuring out how to succinctly pull these populations can be really challenging. But it was a huge learning experience for me, and I really learned a lot about how querying works in Razor's Edge because of that. But yeah, I was able to by a few months later, I was able to kind of pull my first 10-year coverage ratio, and it definitely generated a lot of conversations. The annual giving manager in any organization is going to be probably the person most interested in this. Hopefully your director of development as well is very interested in this. This doesn't do a lot to address your major giving program because those populations are typically pretty small. In my Humane Society, we had ballpark 40 to 50,000 donors a year. Only 200, 250 of those were major gift donors. So, very much this is about your annual giving pipeline. The annual giving manager at that organization has actually since left and moved on to one of our healthcare orgs locally. And she took this with her, and we're still good friends. And so she was like, "Teach me how to do this, because we definitely need this at this place." And so she's using it there, and it's making a lot of change already in that organization as well. So, so long as we got people, you got a team who is data oriented and willing to dive in and really start asking the questions, then you're going to kind of have a lot of progress, I think, with this.
Awesome. I have another question for you about how, you develop your toolkit for these types of metrics. But we have Dennis asking a really good question. He says, in an independent school, would you consider pulling this information by your different segments up? So your different constituency segments, current parents, grandparents, alumni parents, et cetera, et cetera.
Potentially, yes. I'm not done this work specifically in a school setting, although I did used to be a teacher, so I understand where you're coming from. So what I will say is that at the Humane Society that I worked at, I did at first, just because we have very specific segments in any organization. You have very specific segments. You have people who give to only during events. You have people who give only for direct mail. You have people who are honor memorial donors. You have whatever. You can kind of slice and dice things however you want to. What I found was that in general, when I did kind of these specific segments, the story was basically the same. You found the same sort of peaks and valleys usually, and when you start kind of winnowing your population down smaller and smaller, the magnitude of the change can be much more dramatic. So if I'm looking at 100 donors versus 1,000 donors, and I lose 10 donors in each, depending on, overall. So those 10 donors were from that 100 people, and those 100 people were also part of my 1,000 people. That is, that suddenly what would be a 1% decrease looks like a 10% decrease. So you've got to be careful about that. When you're doing analytics with small numbers, small changes look like big problems. So just be very careful with that.
And plus, much more of it could be random.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. The greater your population is, the less that randomness, that noise becomes, the less likely that is to become a problem. So yeah, just be careful with that. If you've got really large segments at all those different kind of cohorts, then okay, then maybe that's worth it. But if you're suddenly only looking at 200 people, this might not be the right kind of metric for that.
Really, really good thoughts. Okay, here's where I may leave the room and leave you and Kirk to duke it out. I have no idea. I kind of, but not really. What he's asking, but he says in terms of major giving, you could pull something similar to coverage rate or with pledges in terms of volume and revenue.
Yeah.
See how much is coming in, going out. Oh, I'm actually leaving.
Yeah. You could definitely use, you want to, instead of looking at donors, you're looking at dollars, right? And
okay.
you're looking at how much revenue did I retain year over year? How much new revenue did I generate? How much revenue from lapsed donors did I generate? So on and so forth. So yeah, you could do something like that. I can't say that I've ever done something analogous to a coverage ratio in that way, but you
Mhm.
certainly could. I could see where you're going with that. That could be very interesting.
Thank you. I've seen that in the annual fund world with retained income.
Yeah.
People do talk about that type of thing. Well, and then we just have community. Georgia, thanks so much for being here with us. Um, Kirk is cueing some music. I have a question for you, Ryan.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're a young professional, and other than having a boss who went to a webinar who asks you and then figuring that out, what learning communities have you found to be helpful? The Blackbot, like where do people share these tricks of the trade that are so valuable?
So your random webinars that are not database, based on data,
The database.
are always valuable. Keep your eyes peeled. If your local AFP community or whatever community you're part of out here at DPP. Certainly, the Blackbaud online communities have been very, very useful to me over the years. When I first started off, I spent a ton of time in Blackbaud's own hosted community.
Yep.
Their Facebook, they have a huge Facebook community. I spent a lot less time there just because I'm not nearly so active on Facebook.
Mhm.
But I know a lot of people who swear by that community. It is very large. So asking questions and just paying attention to the kinds of questions that are asked within those communities is really, really useful. I know that for myself, I kind of, when I started off, I was the one asking all the questions. And then after a while, I realized I was the one able to answer a lot of the questions.
Of
And
course.
once you start feeling confident enough to be the kind of person who answers the questions because you understand how the data is structured, because you understand how to pull out data and import data and do all those sorts of things, then you can let other people's kind of problems that they're bringing up become your own kind of learning
Exactly.
opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a flywheel, right? Once you get
Yeah.
going, it's easier and easier.
Exactly. So, what I always tell people who are really interested in this stuff is just kind of dive in wherever you can, and start seeing where those questions and where those answers kind of take you. Um, I always point out here I'm fortunate enough, extremely fortunate. My wife has a PhD in data science. So coming from, I used to be an English teacher. I didn't, now I basically do math for a living. It's very strange. But in my early years there, as I came across these various questions, I was able to just ask her after work, or sometimes during work, we would like be on GChat or something. Be like, if I wanted to accomplish X, Y, or Z, how would I go about that? And she'd be able to kind of walk me through the steps. She doesn't know a lot about fundraising, but math is math. So
Well, some options for everybody, communities, including the one from Blackbot, including our little group, the Donor Participation Project, marriage,
yep.
finding interesting problems to work on. That's I find that lots of the time it's the quality of the question that really drives how much learning happens, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if
Those
you're
are good
not
points.
getting good quality questions within your organization, yeah, find good quality questions outside of it, then learn how to apply them to your organization.
That's great. We have a request for a bass solo, and hey, well,
Good. You notice that one of these is actually a bass. Okay, so yeah, the one off the corner, that's a bass. All the others are guitars.
well, Joe, I hope you have your random trivia for the day. You're leading a user group, right?
Yes. Yeah, in the Rochester area, if anybody happens to be local in upstate New York, yeah, I run a local user group. We meet basically quarterly, sometimes virtually, sometimes in person. Been running this group for a number of years now, and yeah, it's been. And it's another kind of good way to build up your confidence in this stuff. Another
Exactly.
good way to generate questions is just start figuring out who inside of your local community is working in nonprofits, is working in the same database platform that you are, and start meeting up with them.
Mhm.
Which can be a tall order if there is no local user group around. But most places, most at least big metros, usually have like an AFP chapter that you can
Mhm.
reach out to and see if they're doing anything with the database side of things.
Uh-huh.
That's how we got our started. Me and another person kind of started this thing many years ago, and we just used the AFP email list because we had some connections there and got a lot of interest right away because there was a huge need that wasn't being met.
Awesome. I think, yeah, that's what Kirk was talking about. Well, Ryan, this has been a fantastic learning experience, not only about donor retention, but learning about learning in the context of, being a nonprofit professional. This has been absolutely wonderful. I think we have Elon Musk to thank for having connected, because
Yes.
then you got
I
out
was
of Twitter.
wondering where you were going with that first, but okay.
and we met there. So very grateful. Thanks a lot. And thanks for sharing. Thanks for all you do.
It's been my pleasure. I really enjoy doing this sort of thing, and really, truly, if anybody has additional questions afterwards, feel free to email me anytime. I'm always really happy to chat about this stuff.
Oh, we forgot the last place to learn, LinkedIn. Great place. You can actually go straight, to the horse's mouth right here. Bye, everybody. Bye, Ryan. Thank you.
Bye.